I was kicked out at 14 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a restless heart. I had $5 to my name and a broken world around me. Then I found a house no one wanted, a literal wreck, and somehow it became everything I never dreamed possible. What happened inside those walls changed my life forever, and it all started with that $5. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Storyflow Diaries. I still remember the day I turned 14 like it was yesterday. The air felt heavy, like it knew something bad was about to happen. I had been living with my parents, or at least trying to, but things had been unraveling quietly for months. I had no idea that a few words from my father could change my entire life. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me, his eyes cold and distant, and said, "You're on your own from now on. Pack your things." That was it. No explanation, no warning, just a line that felt heavier than any brick I could have carried. I wandered out of the house, backpack slung over my shoulder, my mind spinning. 14, alone, with nothing. I had no job, no plan, no friends who could help. All I had was $5 that I had saved from doing odd jobs for neighbors. It felt like a cruel joke. $5. $5 to live in a world that suddenly didn't want me? The streets weren't kind. I slept under bridges and in abandoned buildings. Every night I whispered to myself that this was temporary, that somehow things would change. People passed by without noticing me, but I noticed them. Families, kids my age heading home from school, parents laughing together, and I realized just how much I had lost and how much I had never truly had. Loneliness becomes loud when you're 14. It doesn't whisper, it shouts. One day, I was wandering through the outskirts of town when I noticed a for sale sign on a property that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the front door hung off its hinges. Most people would have laughed at it. I, however, felt a strange pull. The sign said $5. I blinked, thinking it was a typo. $5, not 5,000, not 500, $5. It seemed impossible, but it was true. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer, inspecting the house. Inside, it was worse than I imagined. Broken furniture, water-stained walls, a ceiling that looked like it could collapse at any moment. Yet there was something about it that made my heart race. It was empty, yes, but full of potential. I could feel it, the bones of a home, the space waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. The next day, I went to the county office with my $5 clutched tightly in my hand. The clerk raised an eyebrow when I said I wanted to buy the house. "You're serious?" he asked. I nodded, my heart hammering. He laughed softly, but processed the paperwork anyway. The papers were signed. I owned it, my first real property, my first anchor in a world that had tried to cast me adrift. I didn't know anything about fixing houses. My parents had never taught me practical skills beyond basic chores, and I had no one to guide me. But I learned quickly. I watched YouTube tutorials on repairs, I scoured dumpsters for wood and old furniture, and I spent countless nights figuring out plumbing, electricity, and painting. Every nail hammered, every wall patched, every floorboard laid was a victory. Slowly, the house stopped feeling like a ruin and started feeling like home, my home. Neighbors began to notice the changes. One by one, people who had written off the house started stopping by to compliment the work I was doing. They asked questions. They offered advice. Some offered tools. I had never had anyone treat me like this before, like I belonged somewhere, like I mattered. It was a tiny community of people who had no reason to care about a 14-year-old living in a wrecked house, yet they did, and that mattered more than I can express. By the time I was 15, I had transformed most of the house. It still wasn't perfect, but it was livable. I added a small garden in the backyard, painted the walls bright colors, and even found secondhand furniture that gave it character. Every morning, waking up in that house reminded me that I had survived. I had been thrown out, but I had claimed something in return, something real, something mine. Of course, life wasn't suddenly easy. School was a challenge. I had to figure out how to get there from my tiny corner of independence. I got a part-time job at a local grocery store, working evenings and weekends. I remember one night, exhausted, sitting on the porch steps of the house, staring at the stars and thinking about how far I had come. I was still a kid, but I was learning resilience in ways most kids never had to. And then, just as I began to feel some sense of stability, life threw another curveball. My father appeared one evening, standing at the edge of my garden. He looked older, worn down, and strangely remorseful. I froze, unsure if I should run or confront him. He didn't speak at first. Finally, he said, "I heard about the house. I wanted to see if you were okay." My first instinct was anger. He had abandoned me. He had left me to figure out survival on my own. But looking at him, I realized he wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't there to take control. He was just human, and maybe in some way seeking connection. I didn't know what to say. I invited him inside, cautiously. The house was small, humble, and lived in. He looked around, visibly impressed. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, unsure if I wanted approval or just recognition. We didn't fix everything that night. We didn't have to. But something shifted. I saw him not as my tormentor, but as someone capable of remorse and perhaps capable of change. Even with that small step, the real transformation was mine. The house had become a symbol, a proof that even when life treats you unfairly, you can reclaim your world. I had taken $5, a broken house, and turned it into hope. I had created something permanent in a life that had been defined by instability. And I realized in that quiet, sunlit kitchen that home isn't just a building. Home is what you make of it, the courage you pour into it, the resilience you discover along the way. As the days passed, I continued to improve the house. I installed shelves for books, created a tiny reading nook by the window, and painted the rooms with bright, inviting colors. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about healing. Every stroke of paint, every repaired door felt like I was reclaiming parts of myself that had been lost in the chaos of being kicked out. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was restoring my dignity, my confidence, and my belief that life could be better. The local community, once skeptical, began to see me differently. Some of the older neighbors who had watched my family struggle began to offer help, tools, advice, even small gifts like plants or furniture. They didn't just see a kid who had fallen on hard times. They saw someone who refused to be broken. That recognition, small as it might seem, gave me the fuel I needed to keep pushing forward, to keep building not just a home, but a life. I knew that the real challenges weren't over. School, work, and the responsibilities of maintaining a home were overwhelming at times. There were nights I cried alone, questioning if I was truly capable of making this life work. But the house stood as a testament to my resilience. Each improvement, each repair was proof that I could survive, that I could create stability where none existed before. By the time I reached 16, the house had completely transformed. From a crumbling, abandoned structure, it had become a cozy, vibrant home. The sense of pride I felt walking through each room was indescribable. I had created something permanent, something meaningful, and most importantly, something that belonged to me. That house had changed my life, not just by giving me shelter, but by teaching me that I could endure, create, and thrive. After the house had begun to feel like home, I started noticing the subtle ways my life was changing. It wasn't just the structure itself or the paint on the walls. It was the way I saw myself. Each morning, I woke up knowing that I had accomplished something the day before. That feeling, small as it might seem to some, was revolutionary for a kid who had been discarded by their own family. I began to understand that the world could be cool, yes, but it wasn't unchangeable. I could change my corner of it. School became more than a place to learn. It became a proving ground. I was determined not to let my situation define me. Every assignment I completed, every test I passed, felt like a brick in the foundation of a life I was rebuilding. I noticed my classmates looking at me differently too. Some whispered, some stared, but a few reached out. It was strange. After months of isolation, I was slowly learning how to navigate friendships and trust again. I didn't fully open up to anyone yet. I had been burned too many times. But I listened more, smiled more, and began to understand that connection was possible, even after betrayal. My part-time job at the grocery store became a lifeline. I worked evenings stocking shelves, bagging groceries, and sometimes cleaning up spills that no one else wanted to touch. At first, it was exhausting. My 14-year-old body wasn't built for long hours on my feet, but the paycheck felt like freedom. I was paying my own way, repairing my own home, and buying things I needed. There was pride in that independence, a quiet satisfaction that no one could take away. And slowly, the neighborhood began to take notice. People who had once looked at the broken house with disgust now nodded at me on the street. "You've done a good job with that place," they'd say. The real turning point, though, came one rainy afternoon. I was finishing repairs in the living room when a small, scruffy dog wandered onto my porch. He was soaked, shivering, and clearly had been abandoned. I didn't know what made me do it. I was careful not to attach to things that could be taken away, but I took him in, wrapped him in an old blanket, fed him what little I had, and let him curl up beside me. For the first time, I felt a sense of companionship that wasn't conditional, that didn't involve complicated family politics or betrayal. That dog became my first friend in the house, my first real anchor in a life that had been defined by loss. That night, as I sat with him sleeping at my feet, I thought about my father. I still hadn't fully forgiven him, and maybe I never would. But I realized something important. I didn't need him to define me anymore. My worth wasn't tied to his approval or my mother's absence or anyone else's judgment. It was tied to the choices I made, the care I put into my home, and the courage I found every single day. That realization became my silent mantra. I can survive, I can build, I can belong. Months passed. The house continued to improve. I built a small shed in the backyard where I kept tools and materials. I even started experimenting with making furniture out of discarded wood. A broken chair became a small bookshelf. A warped table became a desk. It was slow work, tedious and sometimes frustrating, but it gave me a sense of agency I had never known.
The house was no longer just a shelter, it was a canvas, a place where I could express my creativity and resilience. One evening, a neighbor knocked on my door. Mrs. Thompson was an elderly woman who had lived across the street for decades. She had seen my family's struggles and had watched me rebuild the house with quiet admiration. She handed me a small envelope. "I don't know if this will help, but I want you to have it." Inside was $20, enough to buy paint or nails, or maybe even a small treat for the dog. I felt tears prick my eyes. It wasn't the money itself, but the gesture. Someone believed in me, even in the smallest way, and that mattered more than I could explain. By the time I was 16, the house was almost unrecognizable from the day I bought it. What had once been broken and abandoned now radiated warmth and life. I had created a home for myself, a sanctuary in a world that had shown me very little kindness. But the most important changes weren't physical, they were inside me. I had learned patience, determination, and the quiet power of resilience. I had learned that hope isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Despite all of this, the past was never far away. My father continued to drift in and out of my life. Sometimes he called, asking questions about the house or my well-being. Sometimes he showed up at the door with apologies that never quite felt complete. I learned to listen without expectation, to respond without anger, and to protect the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. I was no longer a passive child waiting for validation. I was an active participant in my own story, and I refused to let anyone else dictate the narrative. School became more than survival, it became opportunity. I began applying for scholarships and programs that could help me pursue skills in construction and design. I had discovered a love for building, both structures and a life from scratch. Teachers noticed my dedication and resilience, offering guidance and letters of recommendation. Slowly, I began to see a future that didn't just include surviving, but thriving. By 17, the house had become a symbol in the neighborhood. Children who once peeked through the windows with curiosity now asked if they could help with small projects. Parents dropped by with advice or tools, sometimes just to chat. I had inadvertently built a community around the house that had started as nothing more than a crumbling structure. It was humbling, surreal, and deeply rewarding. I realized that the house had given me more than shelter. It had given me a purpose, a role, and a sense of belonging. One day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a local newspaper asking if they could feature my story. At first, I hesitated. My life had been private, raw, and messy, but I also realized that my journey could inspire someone else, just as neighbors and strangers had inspired me. I agreed, and the article ran with the headline, "Teen Turns $5 into Dream Home." The response was overwhelming. People from across the town sent letters, some offering help, some sharing their own struggles, some simply saying, "If you can do this at 14, maybe I can try too." It was at that moment I understood something fundamental. The house hadn't just saved me, it had given me the chance to touch other lives. Every repaired wall, every painted surface, every small addition wasn't just a marker of my survival, it was proof that hope could be tangible, that one person's determination could ripple out and affect others in ways I hadn't imagined. Life, of course, wasn't perfect. There were still nights I worried about money, about school, about the uncertainty of the future. There were still moments when loneliness crept in, when the absence of a real family weighed heavily on me. But the house stood as a reminder. I had survived worse. I had built something beautiful from nothing. I had found strength in adversity. And most importantly, I had discovered that my life, my choices, and my resilience could define me more than any betrayal ever could. As I sat on the porch one evening, the dog curled up beside me, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From a scared, abandoned 14-year-old to someone who had created stability, purpose, and hope, the transformation was profound. I had taken a house that no one wanted, a life that seemed impossible, and forged something extraordinary. It wasn't just about survival, it was about reclaiming life, dignity, and possibility.
The summer after my 17th birthday was the first time I truly felt like the house was mine in every sense of the word. I had spent years patching it up, painting walls, repairing floors, and creating a life out of rubble, but now it felt alive. Every corner of it held a memory. Nails hammered in midnight, paint spilled in excitement, laughter shared with the dog on rainy afternoons. It was no longer just a shelter. It had become my sanctuary, a testament to what I could accomplish even when life tried to push me down. One morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. Sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds, hitting the freshly painted walls in golden streaks. I stood barefoot on the wooden floor, stretching, and thought about how far I'd come. 14-year-old me wouldn't have believed it. 14-year-old me would have laughed bitterly if someone had told her she'd own a home, create a garden, and even inspire a community by 18. But here I was. It was surreal, almost unbelievable, yet entirely real. School had become a place where I no longer felt like an outsider. I had friends, albeit cautious and carefully chosen, who respected my story and my drive. I spent my free hours drawing plans for the house, imagining new ways to expand the garden or build a small porch swing. Every improvement wasn't just physical, it was therapeutic. I was healing in ways I didn't even know I needed, patching up more than walls, mending the parts of myself that had been fractured by abandonment and neglect. Despite the sense of progress, the past had a way of creeping back in. My father, still inconsistent in his appearances, showed up one evening carrying a small gift, a set of old books he had found in his attic. He didn't speak much, just handed them to me and left. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, nostalgia, resentment, and surprisingly gratitude. I realized then that I had built a life that didn't require him, but that didn't mean I couldn't accept gestures of reconciliation when offered without expectation. I had control over my narrative now, and that control was empowering. One day I decided to tackle the backyard. It had been a neglected, weed-filled mess when I bought the house, and though I had planted a small garden, there was so much more potential. I spent hours clearing brush, leveling the ground, and creating small flower beds. As I dug, planted, and watered, a strange sense of peace settled over me. It was as if the act of nurturing the garden mirrored the way I was nurturing my own life, slowly, patiently, and with care. Every bloom that emerged felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that life could flourish even in places that once seemed hopeless. Neighbors began to take notice of the transformation. Mr. Alvarez, an elderly man who lived 2 houses down, stopped by one afternoon with a wheelbarrow full of compost. "Thought you might need this," he said with a smile. It wasn't just the material health that mattered, it was the recognition, the acknowledgement that I was doing something meaningful. Over time, more neighbors began to offer small contributions: a bag of soil, a few packets of seeds, even advice on how to make the garden thrive. They didn't know me deeply, but they respected the work I was doing. That respect felt like an antidote to the rejection I had experienced in my family. School projects and responsibilities continued to challenge me. There were days when I questioned whether I could handle everything: grades, work, home repairs, and the growing sense of independence that both exhilarated and terrified me. I learned to prioritize, to set goals, and to embrace the small victories. When I finally completed a particularly challenging home improvement project, I would stand back, look at my handiwork, and feel a surge of pride. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress, and I had become intimately familiar with what progress felt like.
Around this time, I began to consider my future more seriously. The house had taught me so much about construction and design, and I realized I had a genuine passion for it. I started researching vocational programs and apprenticeships, reaching out to people who worked in construction and design, and seeking guidance wherever I could find it. I wanted to turn the skills I had honed out of necessity into something that could shape a career. The thought of building a life beyond survival, of building professionally as well as personally, was thrilling. One evening, as I was painting the last trim in the living room, my neighbor Mrs. Thompson stopped by. She watched quietly for a few minutes, then said softly, "You know, this house isn't just beautiful, it's a testament to your strength." I paused, brush in hand, and realized she was right. The house had become more than a home. It was a symbol of resilience, courage, and the refusal to be defined by misfortune. It had been a crumbling, abandoned structure when I bought it, and now it radiated life and hope. In a way, it mirrored my own journey. That summer, I decided to host a small gathering for the neighborhood kids. It wasn't anything fancy, just lemonade, some snacks, and a chance to show off the garden. As I watched them run around, laughing and playing, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The house had not only provided me with stability, but had become a source of joy and connection for others. The experience reminded me that even in the darkest times, acts of care, whether for a home, a garden, or people, could create ripples that extend far beyond what I could see. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were nights when fear crept in, when I worried about money, school, or the future. There were days when exhaustion weighed heavily, and the thought of continuing seemed almost unbearable. But I had learned a critical truth. The challenges themselves weren't insurmountable. They were opportunities to test my limits, to discover the depth of my resilience, and to grow in ways I never imagined. Every struggle had taught me something essential, and every victory, no matter how small, reinforced my belief in myself. By the end of the summer, I had made significant progress on both the house and the garden. I'd repaired the roof, installed new windows, painted every interior wall, and planted vegetables alongside flowers. It wasn't perfect, and there were still repairs that needed attention, but the transformation was undeniable. People who had once doubted the potential of the house now admired it. I had turned what everyone else saw as a worthless property into a living, breathing testament to perseverance and vision. Around this time, I also began writing down my story. I didn't intend for anyone to read it at first. It was a personal exercise, a way to process everything I had been through. I wrote about the fear of being kicked out, the despair of having only $5, the nights spent in abandoned buildings, and the gradual transformation of the house. Writing allowed me to reflect on my journey, to see the patterns of resilience and courage that it carried me through, and to internalize the lessons I had learned. In one particularly reflective entry, I wrote, "This house is more than bricks and paint. It is proof that life can be rebuilt, that hope can flourish even in the smallest spaces, and that we are capable of more than we realize when we refuse to give up." Reading those words later, I realized that I had come to see my own life as a construction project, not just repairing damage, but intentionally creating something lasting and meaningful. As autumn approached, the house had become a true home. The dog, now named Rusty, had grown into a loyal companion, always greeting me at the door after school or work. The garden was flourishing, with vegetables ready to harvest and flowers adding color to every corner. The walls, once cracked and peeling, now radiated warmth, reflecting the life I had poured into them. The house had become a physical manifestation of my inner strength, a space where I could retreat, create, and reflect on everything I had endured and accomplished. The past continued to ripple through my life as well. My father's sporadic appearances reminded me that not all wounds are easily healed, and that forgiveness, when it comes, must be on my terms. I had learned to navigate these interactions without losing myself, to accept gestures without surrendering my independence, and to set boundaries that protected the life I had fought so hard to build. It was a delicate balance, but I was learning that resilience was not just about physical survival, it was about emotional and mental strength as well. In those quiet moments, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The house had given me more than shelter. It had given me purpose, identity, and the courage to dream. It had taught me that life's hardships, while painful, are not permanent, and that the effort to build, repair, and nurture can transform even the most broken circumstances into something extraordinary. As I entered my 18th year, the house had become more than just a home. It had become a reflection of my journey, a monument to survival and self-discovery. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, looking out at the garden I had nurtured for months, and realizing how much this place had changed me. Every repaired wall, every bloom, every small improvement was a reminder that even the smallest effort could lead to something extraordinary. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, creating, and claiming a life that had once seemed impossible. School had become a source of both challenge and pride. I was determined not just to graduate, but to excel, to prove to myself that the setbacks of my early teens would not define me. I spent countless hours after classes working on homework and projects, sometimes falling asleep on the couch surrounded by textbooks and sketches for future home improvements. My teachers began to notice my persistence and dedication. One teacher, Mrs. Langley, even told me, "You have a rare kind of strength. I can see it in the way you approach life." That simple acknowledgement filled me with a mix of pride and humility. Rusty, my dog, had grown into a constant companion and a source of comfort during moments of loneliness. There were nights when the weight of my responsibilities pressed down on me, when the idea of continuing seemed exhausting. But Rusty was always there, nudging me, lying beside me, reminding me that I was not completely alone in the world. Caring for him taught me patience, empathy, and the importance of small, consistent acts of responsibility. In many ways, he had become as much a teacher as any adult in my life. Around this time, I started taking on small jobs in the neighborhood, helping neighbors with odd repairs or yard work in exchange for money or tools. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they were empowering. Every time I earned a little extra, I reinvested it in the house, buying paint, wood, or supplies that could further transform the space. The house was evolving almost as quickly as I was, and more importantly, the process reminded me that independence wasn't just about having a home. It was about being capable, resourceful, and resilient in the face of challenges. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the porch railing, I noticed a young girl peering over the fence. She was probably 10 or 11, and her eyes were wide with curiosity. "Do you live here by yourself?" she asked hesitantly. I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, just me and Rusty." She gasped softly. "Wow, you did all this?" I nodded again. "It's been a lot of work, but I like it this way." She stared for a moment, then ran off, shouting to her friends about the amazing house. I watched her go, and for the first time, I realized that what I had built wasn't just for me. People saw it. They admired it. It had become a source of inspiration, even unintentionally. As autumn approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, from being kicked out at 14 with only $5 to transforming a broken house into a home. The journey had been grueling, humbling, and deeply transformative. I had learned lessons that no textbook could teach: how to endure hardship, how to find hope in the smallest things, and how to build something lasting from almost nothing. The house had been my teacher, my sanctuary, and ultimately my mirror, reflecting the person I had become. My father continued to appear sporadically in my life. Sometimes he came with apologies or small gestures of goodwill, and other times he disappeared again without explanation. Initially, I felt anger and resentment, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. But over time, I realized that his actions, or lack thereof, did not define my worth or my future. I had learned to separate my past from my present, to accept that while people can disappoint, their choices don't have to dictate my life. I had built too much to allow anyone else's mistakes to shake me. By the time winter approached, the house was nearly complete. I had finished painting the interior walls, repaired the roof, installed new windows, and expanded the garden with vegetables and flowers that would bloom for years to come. Each task, no matter how small, was a reminder of my growth. I had gone from a frightened, abandoned child to someone who could take control of her life, create stability, and find joy in her accomplishments. It was an extraordinary transformation, one that felt almost magical at times, though I knew it had come from hard work, determination, and an unwillingness to give up. Around this time, I also began to think about the future beyond the house. I had discovered a love for construction and design and realized that the skills I had developed could lead to a meaningful career. I started researching vocational programs and apprenticeships, reaching out to local contractors and designers for advice. Every small connection felt like a door opening. I realized that the house, while central to my survival, had also become a stepping stone to opportunities I hadn't dared to dream of before. One snowy evening, as I sat on the porch with Rusty at my feet, I received a call from a local youth mentorship program. They had heard about the house through the newspaper article and wanted to know if I would be interested in sharing my story with other kids who were facing hardship. My heart raced as I considered the opportunity. For so long, I had been focused solely on survival. Now there was a chance to turn my experience into something that could help others. I agreed immediately, feeling a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I shared my journey with small groups of kids, explaining how I had turned $5 and a broken house into a home and a future. I spoke about perseverance, hope, and the importance of taking small, consistent actions even when the odds seemed impossible. Watching the children's faces light up with understanding and inspiration, I realized that my story was bigger than me. It had the power to encourage others to believe in themselves, even in the darkest times. Through this process, I also discovered a deeper understanding of forgiveness and resilience. My father's sporadic presence had been painful, but it had taught me how to set boundaries, protect myself emotionally, and accept that people can change at their own pace or not at all. I didn't need his approval to validate my accomplishments. I had created my own validation through hard work, determination, and unwavering commitment to my goals. That lesson became a cornerstone of the guidance I offered to others. You can't control what life hands you, but you can control how you respond. The house, once a broken and abandoned shell, now radiated warmth, life, and purpose. Friends, neighbors, and visitors often remarked on the transformation, but to me, the greatest reward was the sense of agency and resilience it represented. Every repaired wall, every painted surface, every flourishing plant in the garden was a testament to my ability to endure, adapt, and create. It was tangible proof that even in the face of adversity, something beautiful could emerge. As the months passed, I continued to balance school, work, home repairs, and community engagement. There were challenges, of course, nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, days when setbacks tested my patience, but each challenge reinforced my understanding that resilience is not innate, it is cultivated through action, reflection, and perseverance. I had learned that life is less about the circumstances you are given and more about the choices you make within them. By the time I reached my 18th birthday, the house had fully transformed. From a crumbling, abandoned property, it had become a vibrant home filled with warmth, hope, and possibility. The journey had been long, painful, and at times lonely, but it had also been empowering, revealing strengths I didn't know I possessed. I had taken a place that everyone else had written off and turned it into something extraordinary, not just a house, but a symbol of hope, courage and determination. Sitting on the porch with Rusty watching the sunset, I reflected on everything that had brought me here. The hardships, the isolation, the moments of despair, they had all been part of a larger lesson. The house had taught me that even in the most difficult circumstances, action and perseverance could lead to transformation. It had taught me that independence is earned through courage and determination. And most importantly, it had shown me that even when life feels broken, it is possible to build something lasting, beautiful, and meaningful.
The months following my 18th birthday were some of the busiest and most transformative of my life. I had finished the major renovations on the house, the garden was thriving, and Rusty had grown into a lively companion who never left my side. I started thinking more seriously about what I wanted beyond the house, beyond simply surviving or maintaining a home, and I realized that I wanted to create a life that could support me and maybe even inspire others. I began applying to vocational programs in construction and interior design, writing letters and submitting applications with the same determination I had poured into repairing the house. I wanted to learn professionally the skills I had learned out of necessity, and I wanted to use them to build a future that was entirely my own. The days were long and exhausting, balancing school, work, and responsibilities around the house. But for the first time in my life, the exhaustion was paired with a sense of purpose and fulfillment. I no longer felt like a child abandoned by circumstances. I felt like a young adult shaping her destiny with her own hands. Every small victory, whether it was repairing a broken window, painting a room, or finally harvesting vegetables from the garden, was a reminder that effort mattered and that persistence could turn something broken into something extraordinary. Neighbors continued to take notice of the house and of me. Mr. Alvarez, who had helped with the compost months before, stopped by one morning to offer advice on installing a small trellis for climbing plants. Mrs. Thompson often brought over homemade bread or cookies just to check in and share a moment of warmth. Their gestures, small as they were, reinforced the sense that I wasn't as alone as I once believed. Even though I had started out with nothing, the house had created community, and the people around me were now invested in my journey as much as I was. Around this time, my father began showing up more frequently, sometimes with gifts, other times just with apologies that seemed sincere but incomplete. I learned to navigate these encounters with patience and caution. I didn't owe him forgiveness, but I could offer him acknowledgement without compromising my boundaries. I had grown too much to be swayed by guilt or the hope for validation from someone who had once abandoned me. Each interaction reminded me that resilience wasn't just about physical survival, it was about emotional strength, self-respect, and the ability to maintain control of my narrative. One particularly cold evening, I decided to host a small dinner for some of the neighbors who had supported me over the past few years. I cooked what little I could manage, served it with care, and watched as people laughed and shared stories. It struck me then that the house was more than a personal achievement, it was a gathering place, a symbol of transformation, hope, and connection. People who had once doubted me or written off the property as worthless now respected what had been created. It wasn't just about the physical renovations, it was about the life that had grown within and around those walls. During the winter, I also began documenting the house more formally. I started keeping detailed journals about repairs, design ideas, and personal reflections on the journey that had brought me here. I wanted to capture not just the physical transformation, but the lessons I had learned along the way. I wrote about the fear of being abandoned, the nights spent with nothing but $5 in my pocket, the small triumphs of fixing a wall or planting a flower, and the sense of empowerment that came from creating stability and beauty from nothing. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process the past while planning for the future, and it helped me internalize the growth I had achieved.
By spring, the house was fully transformed. The exterior, once peeling and broken, now gleamed with fresh paint and carefully repaired siding. The windows sparkled, allowing sunlight to pour into every room, highlighting the bright colors and small touches that reflected my personality. The garden was lush, filled with vegetables, flowers, and a small trellis I had built for climbing vines. Rusty often lounged in the sun, watching me as I tended the plants, as if acknowledging the effort I had put into everything. The house had become a living testament to resilience and creativity, a place where both life and hope could thrive. With graduation approaching, I realized it was time to plan for the next stage of my life. I had learned so much from the house and the experience of building it from nothing, but I also knew that I needed to continue growing, learning professionally, and creating opportunities beyond my immediate surroundings. I researched programs, apprenticeships, and mentorships, determined to transform the skills I had honed into a career that could sustain me and allow me to inspire others. The same determination that had carried me through being abandoned and turning a broken house into a home now fueled my pursuit of education and professional growth. One afternoon, a local reporter who had written the article about my house returned with a camera crew. They wanted to do a follow-up story on how the house had grown into a hub of community inspiration. As they filmed, I walked them through each room, explaining the repairs, design choices, and garden improvements. I spoke honestly about the challenges I have faced, about being kicked out at 14, about the small victories and setbacks, and about the lessons learned through resilience, hard work, and persistence. Watching their reactions, I realized that my story could truly inspire others, just as the neighbors' support had inspired me in the early days. Even as the media attention grew, life remained grounded in the everyday tasks of running a home. I continued repairs, maintained the garden, and balanced schoolwork and part-time jobs. It was exhausting at times, but it was also fulfilling in a way I had never known. I had built a life that required effort but rewarded perseverance. The house wasn't just a building anymore, it was a living testament to the idea that even the smallest resources, applied with care, determination, and vision, can create extraordinary results. As summer approached, I began mentoring some of the younger kids in the neighborhood who were facing challenges similar to what I had endured. I taught them basic repairs, gardening skills, and the value of persistence. I shared my story, emphasizing that circumstances don't define you, but the choices you make within them do. Seeing their eyes light up with understanding and hope reminded me that the house had not only changed my life, but could ripple out to change the lives of others. It was a lesson in the power of resilience, compassion, and using personal experience to help build community. By the end of the year, the house was no longer just a project or a sanctuary, it had become a symbol of possibility. Neighbors, visitors, and the kids I mentored all recognized it as a place where transformation was possible. It had started as a crumbling shell bought for $5, and now it was a vibrant, lived-in home filled with hope, community, and life. Every corner reflected effort, care, and perseverance. It was a place that had grown alongside me, a physical representation of the journey from abandonment to empowerment. The journey was far from over, but I had learned the most important lessons. Life will challenge you, but persistence, creativity, and belief in yourself can create extraordinary outcomes. Even when abandoned, even when resources are scarce, even when hope feels impossible, you can rebuild. You can nurture life and purpose in the smallest spaces. You can create beauty, community, stability, and opportunity from nothing if you refuse to give up. The house had taught me these lessons not through words, but through action, through the late nights, the repairs, the gardening, the persistent care. It had transformed me into someone who could endure hardship and also create something meaningful from it.
As I entered my 19th year, I began to realize that the house had become more than a home or a symbol of my survival. It was a foundation for the future I wanted to build. I started exploring ways to expand my skills and income. I began taking on larger renovation projects for neighbors in exchange for money or tools. I had learned enough about construction, electrical work, and design to handle small houses and apartments, and with each completed project, my confidence grew. I realized that the same determination that had allowed me to transform my $5 house could be applied to almost anything in life. I felt a deep sense of empowerment, knowing that I was creating a path for myself through my own efforts rather than waiting for someone else to provide opportunities. Rusty remained my loyal companion, always by my side as I worked through renovations or tended the garden. His presence was comforting and grounding, and he became a small reminder that even in the midst of hard work and responsibility, there could be moments of joy and companionship. I also began to take care of the property in ways that went beyond repairs and aesthetics. I painted fences, repaired the shed, and installed a small outdoor seating area for neighbors and friends to gather. The house was evolving into a place that not only reflected my resilience, but also encouraged connection and community. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Daniels approached me with a unique opportunity. She had inherited a small property on the edge of town, and she wanted someone to renovate it in exchange for a share of the profits when it sold. I was nervous at first. The stakes were higher than anything I had attempted before, but the challenge excited me. I agreed, knowing that it would require long hours, problem solving, and a lot of creative thinking, but also knowing that I had the skills, patience, and determination to see it through. I spent the following weeks planning the renovation, measuring spaces, creating sketches, and sourcing materials from secondhand stores and discounted suppliers. I treated the project as seriously as I had treated my own house, and slowly the property began to take shape. The renovation was grueling at times. I worked long hours after school, balancing the demands of both my personal home and this new project. I scraped walls, repaired floors, installed cabinets, and painted every surface with care. I encountered unexpected challenges, a leaky roof, a broken foundation beam, plumbing issues, but each obstacle became an opportunity to problem solve and learn. I realized that every repair I had done in my own house had prepared me for this moment. All the mistakes I had made along the way were lessons that now allowed me to work more efficiently and confidently. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving and growing as a skilled young woman capable of handling responsibility beyond my years. During this time, my father reached out again. He wanted to discuss the house, offered advice, and even suggested ways to make the garden flourish. I listened politely, but I had learned to maintain boundaries. I appreciated the effort, even if it came inconsistently, and I realized that my validation no longer depended on him. I had created a life of purpose and accomplishment, and his approval was no longer necessary to confirm my worth. I could interact with him without anger or expectation based on my own terms. As the weeks passed, the new property began to look like a transformation worthy of attention. I documented each stage with photos, writing notes about the repairs and design choices. I shared the updates with Mrs. Daniels, who was impressed with the speed and quality of the work. She mentioned that she had considered selling the property as is, but now she realized it could fetch a significantly higher price due to the renovations. I felt a surge of pride knowing that my skills and effort were creating tangible results, not just for myself, but for others as well. The experience reinforced something I had been learning for years. Resilience and creativity have value beyond personal survival. They can generate opportunities, inspire others, and create a sense of purpose that extends outward.
I also realized that I had developed skills that could become a career. I could see myself teaching, mentoring, and even running a small business focused on renovation and design. The $5 house had been the catalyst, but now I understood that the journey didn't end with survival. It could lead to professional success and personal fulfillment. One quiet evening, I sat on the porch with Rusty curled beside me, looking out at the garden bathed in soft moonlight. I thought about the journey from being kicked out with nothing to owning a thriving home, mentoring others, and developing skills that could sustain a future. The house, once a crumbling, abandoned shell bought for $5, had become a vibrant hub of life, learning, and inspiration. It had taught me lessons no classroom ever could. It had shown me that adversity does not define you, but your response does. It had shown me that even the smallest resources applied with effort and care can create extraordinary results. It had shown me that independence, resilience, and creativity can transform not just a life, but a community. And most importantly, it had shown me that hope is not a passive feeling, but an action manifested in sweat, patience, and determination.
The following year was a turning point in more ways than one. I had fully settled into adulthood while still attending school, working part-time, and taking on renovation projects for neighbors and small businesses. I felt a deep sense of purpose as I balanced these responsibilities and began mentoring teens who reminded me of myself at 14. I started hosting small workshops in the house, teaching basic carpentry, gardening, and design skills, showing them that even limited resources could be transformed into something valuable and lasting. The first group was hesitant at first, shuffling nervously as they entered the house, looking around at the bright walls, the thriving garden, and the projects I had completed over the years. I smiled and explained my story, from being kicked out with $5 to turning a broken house into a home, hoping that my experiences would inspire them to believe in their own potential. I emphasized that it wasn't magic that had transformed my life, but consistent effort, perseverance, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. The kids listened intently, some nodding, others wide-eyed with disbelief, as if the journey I had walked was unimaginable, yet somehow possible. The sense of fulfillment I felt in that moment was indescribable. I had gone from feeling abandoned and powerless to guiding others towards self-sufficiency, confidence, and hope. It was a role I had never imagined for myself, but one that felt deeply meaningful and aligned with the lessons the house had taught me. Life, however, was not without its challenges. My father continued to drift in and out, offering sporadic apologies or gestures of support. I learned to navigate these interactions with caution, acceptance, and self-respect. I could acknowledge his presence without letting it define my sense of worth. I had created a life, skills, and community that were independent of his approval, and that freedom was empowering. I realized that part of growing up was understanding that forgiveness and acceptance do not require someone else's consistency or perfection. They are choices we make for ourselves to find peace and clarity amidst the unpredictability of life. Around this time, I also began exploring ways to expand the house's role in the community. I added a small reading nook in the living room, stocked with books donated by neighbors and local organizations. It became a quiet space where teens and adults could come to read, study, or simply reflect in a supportive environment. I also started a small community garden initiative in the backyard, allowing neighbors to plant vegetables and flowers alongside mine. The garden flourished, and it became a place of collaboration, learning, and connection. It was incredible to see how a house that had started as a broken shell bought for $5 could grow into a center of community, creativity, and hope.
One spring afternoon, I received a call from a local youth program asking if I would share my story at a town event. I hesitated at first because speaking publicly had always made me nervous, but I realized this was an opportunity to reach a larger audience, showing kids and families that resilience and hard work could transform lives. I agreed and spent the next few weeks preparing. I created a presentation, shared photographs of the house's transformation, and reflected on the lessons I had learned about perseverance, independence, and self-belief. On the day of the event, I stood in front of a room full of people, heart racing, but I spoke from the heart. I told them about being kicked out at 14, having only $5, and finding a broken house that became my sanctuary. I explained the nights of hard work, the mistakes made, and the small victories that had built confidence, skills, and hope. The audience was captivated. Some people wiped away tears, others nodded in quiet understanding, and a few teens approached me afterward, expressing that my story had given them courage to face their own challenges. I realized then that the house had become more than a home or project. It was a bridge connecting me to others and providing a tangible example of transformation. The experience also deepened my understanding of what independence truly meant. I had learned that it wasn't just about surviving financially or physically, it was about emotional resilience, creative problem solving, and the ability to nurture relationships and community without losing yourself in the process. I had built a home, mentored others, managed multiple projects, and balanced responsibilities, all while continuing my education and personal growth. I realized that my life was no longer defined by fear or abandonment, but by the choices I made and the effort I invested in building something lasting. As summer approached, I decided to take on another small renovation project, a house that had been abandoned for years in a neighboring town. I wanted to challenge myself, apply my skills in a new environment, and demonstrate that the lessons I had learned could be replicated beyond my own home. I worked tirelessly, repairing walls, floors, plumbing, and electrical systems, and adding personal touches to create a livable space. The project was grueling, and there were nights I fell asleep exhausted on the floor with Rusty curled beside me, but the sense of accomplishment when the work was completed was indescribable. I had taken what had started as an unpromising, abandoned house and transformed it into a welcoming, functional space for a family who would soon move in. It was a reminder that the skills, knowledge, and perseverance I had developed could change lives beyond my own. Throughout this period, I reflected often on the $5 purchase that had started it all. I realized that the true value of that house was never in the money it cost, but in the lessons it forced me to learn. It taught me resilience, independence, problem solving, patience, and empathy. It provided a space to grow, experiment, mistake, repair, and flourish. It connected me with neighbors, mentors, and kids who looked up to me. It had given me a tangible sense of accomplishment, and more importantly, it had given me hope when everything else in life had seemed uncertain. As autumn approached, I noticed subtle shifts in myself. I was more confident, patient, resourceful, and compassionate. I understood that life could be unpredictable, but that didn't mean I was powerless. I could influence my surroundings, help others, create beauty, repair damage, and inspire hope. I realized that the house was no longer simply a symbol of my survival, but a living representation of the values I wanted to carry forward into adulthood: perseverance, creativity, compassion, and community. One evening, I sat on the porch, Rusty at my feet, reflecting on how much had changed in 5 years. I thought about the scared 14-year-old kicked out with only $5, and I barely recognized her. She had been terrified, alone, and uncertain, but she had acted courageously, even without knowing what the future would hold. She had learned that transformation comes from effort, persistence, and belief in oneself. She had discovered that setbacks can become opportunities, that scarcity can fuel creativity, and that hope, when paired with action, can create extraordinary outcomes. I realized then that my journey was not just about a house, it was about life itself and the power of human resilience. The year ended with another community gathering in the house, garden, and backyard. I invited neighbors, teens from my workshops, and friends who had supported me throughout the years. It was a celebration not just of the house, but of growth, connection, transformation, and hope. People shared stories, laughed, helped each other with small repairs or gardening tips, and marveled at the journey from the abandoned, crumbling house to the vibrant home that now stood as a beacon of resilience and inspiration. I watched the faces around me and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I realized that my life, once defined by abandonment and scarcity, had become a source of guidance, community, practical skill building, and hope for others. And yet, I knew there was more to come. The house had taught me the value of persistence, the importance of community, and the transformative power of hard work. But I also realized that these lessons were meant to extend beyond the walls of my home. I began planning larger mentorship programs, community projects, and ways to help more teens gain confidence, skills, and hope. I wanted to show them that no matter their circumstances, they could create meaningful change in their own lives and communities. The journey was far from over, and in many ways, it was just beginning. But the foundation had been laid, and I felt ready to take the lessons of the $5 house into the wider world. By this point, I also began to think more deeply about forgiveness, acceptance, and letting go of resentment. My father's sporadic presence no longer dictated my emotions. I could acknowledge his attempts at connection without giving away my peace or control over my life. I had learned that independence includes emotional boundaries, and that healing sometimes comes from self-awareness and resilience rather than others' actions. I felt stronger, more grounded, and capable of approaching.
By the time I reached my 20th birthday, I realized that the house was no longer just a place to live. It was a testament to everything I had endured, learned, and accomplished in the years since being kicked out at 14 with only $5. I looked around at the walls I had repaired, the garden I had nurtured, and the spaces I had transformed, and felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. Rusty, now older but still my constant companion, lay at my feet as sunlight poured through the windows, highlighting the vibrant colors and the life that had grown here. I thought about how far I had come from the frightened, abandoned teenager who had walked into a crumbling shell of a house and saw only despair in its peeling walls and broken floors. I had taken that fear, that scarcity, and that uncertainty and turned it into resilience, skill, creativity, and hope. I realized that this house was more than a building. It was a mirror reflecting the growth, determination, and courage that I had cultivated in myself. The final year had been full of challenges and victories. I had completed multiple renovation projects for neighbors and clients, mentored dozens of teens in carpentry, gardening, and personal development, and maintained the house and garden that had been the center of my transformation. Every day was demanding, full of problem solving, physical labor, and emotional investment, but it was also deeply fulfilling. I had learned to approach life with a mindset that setbacks are temporary opportunities and that every small action compounds into meaningful results. I knew now that the house had not only shaped my skills, but it shaped my character, teaching me patience, persistence, and the importance of nurturing both objects and people. One chilly autumn morning, I received a letter from a scholarship program for young adults pursuing vocational trades. They had heard about my story through a local feature and were offering financial support for further training in construction and design. I sat on the porch, Rusty at my side, staring at the envelope and realizing that the very house I had transformed had now created opportunities beyond anything I could have imagined at 14. It wasn't the $5 that mattered. It was the choices I had made, the courage I had found in adversity, and the perseverance that had turned that investment into a life-changing journey. I knew that this was the next step, an opportunity to refine my skills and take the lessons of resilience into the broader world. Over the following months, I poured myself into the scholarship program, learning advanced construction techniques, design principles, and professional project management. I approached each lesson with the same diligence that I had applied to my own house and the renovation projects I had taken on. I also continued mentoring, now incorporating more structured guidance for teens who faced challenges like I had. I taught them not only technical skills, but also how to develop resilience, solve problems creatively, and believe in themselves even when circumstances felt impossible. I found immense satisfaction in seeing them grasp concepts, complete small projects, or simply gain confidence through incremental achievements. I realized that what had started as a personal journey had evolved into something bigger, a movement of inspiration, practical skill building, and hope for the next generation. Despite my growth and accomplishments, I never forgot the feelings of fear, abandonment, and scarcity that had defined my early teenage years. I reflected on them often because they reminded me of the stakes and the magnitude of what I had built from nothing. I realized that the house was not only a physical structure, but a symbol of transformation, proof that a life can be remade through effort, creativity, and belief in oneself. I had learned that independence is earned not just through survival, but through persistence, reflection, and action. I could now see clearly that my journey had given me the tools to face future challenges with courage and confidence, regardless of external circumstances. The community around the house continued to grow and thrive. I had established a small program where teens could come to learn practical skills while developing confidence and resilience. The garden expanded, with some teens taking responsibility for sections of it, creating a shared space of beauty, productivity, and learning. The house had become a hub for not just inspiration, but for tangible growth, demonstrating that transformation can ripple outward and touch lives in ways one might never anticipate. I realized that the $5 house that had seemed worthless had now created value far beyond its physical dimensions. It had become a catalyst for personal and communal growth, a living testament to what can happen when determination meets opportunity. I also began reflecting on my father and the complicated relationship that once filled me with anger and resentment. I had learned to engage with him without expectation, acknowledging his sporadic gestures of support while maintaining boundaries that protected my well-being. I realized that forgiveness and peace are not necessarily gifts we give to others, but choices we make for ourselves to preserve clarity, control, and emotional stability. I could honor my journey and accomplishments without needing validation from someone who had once abandoned me. My worth had been established through my own actions, my creativity, and my resilience, not through anyone else's approval. One crisp winter evening, I stood on the porch watching Rusty sleep in the snow-tinged garden. I thought about the years that had passed since buying the house for $5, about the long nights of work, about the mistakes, failures, small victories, and the endless persistence it had taken to turn a broken shell into a vibrant home and a hub of hope. I remembered the fear, loneliness, and uncertainty that had accompanied me at 14, and I realized that the strength I had found in those early days had become the foundation for everything I had built since. Every repaired wall, every painted surface, every flower in the garden was a story, each a testament to resilience, determination, and the ability to create beauty from hardship.
By this time, I had fully embraced the role of mentor, teacher, and example for others. I had teens coming to the house regularly to learn skills, ask questions, or simply be inspired by the journey. I watched them grow in confidence, independence, and creativity, and I realized that the impact of my $5 house extended far beyond my own life. It had become a platform for change, a symbol that even in the darkest circumstances, hope, action, and perseverance can lead to transformation. I felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that the lessons I had learned through hardship were now empowering others to believe in themselves and take meaningful action in their own lives. Looking back, I could see that the $5 house had been the turning point, not because of the money or the property itself, but because of the choices it forced me to make. It demanded resilience, resourcefulness, and courage. I had learned to face fear, solve problems, work tirelessly, seek support when needed, accept help with gratitude, and most importantly, believe that even in broken circumstances, transformation is possible. I had learned to turn scarcity into creativity, abandonment into independence, and obstacles into opportunities. I had grown from a scared, powerless teenager into a capable, confident young adult with purpose, skills, community, mentorship, and hope. On my 20th birthday, I invited neighbors, friends, teens from my workshops, and mentors to a small celebration in the house and garden. The space was vibrant, full of life, stories, and laughter. People marveled at the transformation and shared in the joy of what had been created from nothing. I reflected on the journey from the frightened 14-year-old to the young adult I had become, and I felt a deep sense of closure and accomplishment. I realized that the house had given me more than shelter. It had given me independence, community, skill, confidence, and a platform to inspire others. It had shown me that resilience, creativity, and consistent effort can transform lives in ways that go far beyond the immediate circumstance. As the evening wound down, I sat quietly on the porch, Rusty curled beside me, watching the sunset and feeling the weight of everything I had endured and accomplished. I understood that my journey was a continuous process, but this chapter, the journey from abandonment to empowerment, had reached a meaningful conclusion. The house that had started as a broken, worthless property bought for $5 had become a home, school, community hub, and symbol of hope. It had transformed me, shaped my skills, expanded my opportunities, and given me a sense of purpose that would guide me for the rest of my life. I realized finally that even the smallest beginnings can lead to extraordinary outcomes when courage, action, and perseverance are applied. I had built not just a house, but a life of meaning, resilience, and